Welcome back to the HIM channel. It's so good having you with us, and we're going to have a dynamite show today. In fact, I don't see how we can do this in one particular taping, so this may be part one and part two. But bear with us. Right now, there are a lot of questions being asked about what's going on prophetically. Are we still dealing with the end time? Are we beginning the end time? Or are we starting into the days of tribulation? Well, to start with, I want to tell you that the Bible is very explicit about things that will happen prior to the return of Jesus Christ. Now, Matthew 24 states it very clearly. Revelation 13 talks about some things that will be involved in the economics, politics, and the financial way that the world is conducting business in the last days. So as we start today, we're going to start with these questions, take them one by one, and focus mainly on the economics. But here are some of the questions that are being asked. How will the spirit of the Antichrist and the progressive movement be combined in the last days? Are they one and the same? Do they have the same goals? Do they have the same priorities? Are we looking at the same people? Right now, there's a mass confusion in the world. Not only is the entire geopolitical world upside down, but the economy in all countries are struggling. They're in chaos. In Europe, they're rioting in the streets because their currency is losing value. In America, we're rioting in the streets because there is a crisis mentality and also a civil disorder mentality, and it's being kept by the anti-Semitic group and the Israeli group and the progressive group and the conservative group. We have never been closer to civil disorder in our generation than we are today. So how does it all fit together? How can you make it work? You know, right now, we're talking about a political chaos. Do we have conservatives? Do we have liberals? Do we have libertarians? Or do we have those that are just anti-American and will destroy us at any cost? In our economic structure, how are we set up to survive when the world is changing and going back to different standards? Will the dollar make the reserve currency this generation? Will we see the yuan, the BRICS? Well, don't let me get ahead of myself. You do not want to miss what's about to happen on the HIM channel. We're bringing to the table today one of the foremost leaders in domestic and international finance that I know. I've been privileged to meet several people over the years. I actually had a one-on-one with Alan Greenspan in 2004. He made it very, very clear then the American dollar was unsustainable. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I want you to know that what we're going to talk about today did not happen in the last 72 hours. It has not happened in the last 90 days. This has been on the books for the progressive movement and for international finance for over 30 years. We are living in the most interesting generation that has ever been born because we are watching the world change on a daily basis in every news cycle. We're seeing politicians at each other's throat. We're seeing economies fall. We're seeing nations crumble. And we are seeing military that are raising their head right now, preparing for an onslaught that will make World War II look like a practice session. I've asked the gentleman that's coming on board with us tonight to join us. We're going to darken his face, maybe alter his voice somewhat, because the circles he runs in would not necessarily be pleased with the information he's going to share with you on the HIM channel tonight. I trust him. I've known him for a while. He has never proven one thing to be wrong in anything he says. He has been a friend in all times, more like a brother, and I thank God for him. So we're going to bring him on. Like I said, he is an experienced individual in domestic, international finance, and in the various denominations of world currency that are moving to the forefront, even the precious metal sectors. My friend, thank you for being with us tonight. It's good to have you here. In the notes I put, and where do we go from here? So where do you want to start this?
Well, if you're talking about where we're at today, it might be good to talk about how we got to where we're at today from a financial perspective, I guess, to start with. Or we could start with the stuff about the questions you ask about prophecy. We could start there very quickly and kind of give some ideas on that. Where would you like to start?
Just take your liberty.
Well, let's start with the questions you ask on prophecy, because I think that that's very, very important, because I think most of your audience is probably of a similar religious background. So, assuming that this question about the Antichrist and how that's going to play out and what is so forth and so on. It's interesting because if you look at the word Antichrist, the word Antichrist means instead of or opposed to Christ. It's not just someone that's against Christ, but they're stating a position to be opposed to or against. And then when we look at the Bible, the word Antichrist is only used 5 times. 4 times in the book of 1 John and 1 time in the book of 2 John. And what it says in the book of 1 John is, it says, and many of these deceivers or antichrists are with you already. So the Antichrist is a person that's opposed or against Christ. And even in the time of John's writing, that was an individual who was against or opposed to Christ.
Dean,
so this is not, go ahead.
Just for clarity, what you're saying is there is a spirit of Antichrist that is indwelling in the earth today and has been since the time of Jesus Christ.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the word Antichrist in Greek is antichristos, which just means anti, which means opposed or instead of. It's not a proper name.
And what you're saying instead of, just for clarity's sake, could that mean taking the place of Christ?
In any form or fashion.
Right, okay.
In any form or fashion. And if you notice in 1 John chapter 4, it's talking about the Spirit, basically a spirit of truth, in contrast to a spirit of Antichrist. So it's anything opposite the spirit of truth, which is the Spirit of Christ. So then if you go from there and go back to Matthew 24, the interesting thing about Matthew 24 is at the end of Matthew 24, the writer tells his audience that these things will happen before that generation passes away.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that you won't have earthquakes and wars and things and so forth and so on, even later on as we have now. But what he told his audience was, or the writers told their audience, because it's mentioned in two or three different Gospels. What you'll notice there is they're asking a question as when these things will take place. And what Matthew 24 primarily is talking about is what's going to happen in AD 70. Because the kingdom has come, but the kingdom has not been established yet in Matthew 24. In AD 70, basically Titus surrounded the city of Jerusalem and Jerusalem was destroyed. Jesus
Correct.
told them, in your generation, not one single stone will be standing here.
Right.
Before your generation passes away. But you will see wars and rumors of wars and deceptions, but don't worry about these things because this is not the end. The end happened in this particular circumstance in AD 70 and he also said, when you see the city surrounded by armies, which happened with Titus in AD 70, the writers told them, you better be out of town. You better not be close to Jerusalem because it's fixing to get really, really interesting.
Run to the mountains, right.
And then if you look also at 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, Peter is telling them exactly the same thing, to prepare for the events that are fixing to happen in their lifetime coming soon. Now that does not mean that some of the things that are mentioned in Matthew 24 won't happen before the next stage or at the end of this age. But the end of the season they were talking about there was the season of the law versus the new dispensation of grace, which came into play in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed.
In fact,
So,
I saw an archaeologist that made the statement. He said, I was shocked when we found out that Jerusalem had been rebuilt again after the destruction by Titus. So, in putting these things in correlation, what you're saying is we have a prototype pending here of what things will be like even prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ.
I mean, normally in Scripture, you have physical events that preclude or simultaneously with spiritual events that are happening.
Right,
If we go back to looking at Revelation in chapter 13, where it talks about the beast, for example,
right,
it also talks about there, let the person who has wisdom discern the number of the beast, which is 666, which is that of a man.
correct.
Back to the Antichrist thing for just a second again. What's interesting is that word man there that's used actually is a better translation would be mankind. Because
Exactly.
what interestingly enough it means there is man with his eyes wide opened. Now what's interesting is if you go back to the garden, what happened once Eve ate the apple? Her eyes were
Or
opened.
opened, right.
So what it's talking about there is fleshly man, who basically has become opposed to or does instead of Christ, and he thus takes the mark of the beast, which is the mind of the beast, which is the fleshly mind of sinful man.
Would
As
that be
opposed to,
like a carnal mind as we're speaking today?
absolutely, the carnal mind, the sinful nature, however you want to describe it. Because in previously in Revelation 13, it says, let the one who has wisdom or the one who has understanding. Well, the one who has wisdom and understanding has obtained the mind of Christ. Thus, they can discern those who have the mark of the beast, which is that of a man whose eyes are wide open, but not yet mature on that path towards the mind of Christ.
All right.
So what he's talking about there, when he talks about the two beasts in Revelation, the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth, the beast of the sea represents very generally here a political system, and the beast of the earth represents a religious system. Unfortunately, in our circumstances, they've become one and the same in far too many instances. And so it's the apostate religious system and the political religious system, which have become one and the same. And so basically, John is telling his readers in Revelation, ascertain this, see what's happening here. And that's exactly what's happening right now that we're going through. And
Now,
interestingly
would
enough,
you,
and this is
let me
complete
insert
different.
this. Do
Go
you
ahead.
think this is the woke mentality that's attacking the world right now, that's changing the minds of men away from God?
Well, certainly it is, but if you look back, what is woke? At the end of the day, woke is basically it's an attack on the principles of Christ,
Right.
of the principles of truth.
Those things which
And
are
so,
holy, those things which are steadfast.
yeah, so it's nothing new except for the sense that I think as time goes on, man becomes more and more creative in his depravity.
All right. I can see that.
So then, and another just interesting sidelight, if you look at the book, Revelation chapter 13, the two beasts that are mentioned, if you go back to the fourth beast in the book of Daniel, it's talking about exactly the same thing.
Exactly. And the,
So
the
anyway,
duplicity of the attack is religious and political, that encompasses all of our life. We are built on a religious and a political statue here. That's our platform.
yes, and if you look at the challenges we're having around the world, all of them, one way or another, are based upon religion. True, not necessarily true religion, but if you look at the things that are going on in the Middle East, there's two sides, both of which have different religious points of view.
Right. Right. You've got the fatwa coming from the Arab nation and being fortified by the Persians, which is Iran. And then you've got the Judeo-Christian application in Israel, where Judaism is under attack. And then when you look at it, we are supporting the spirit of Antichrist as a nation. I'm talking about America now, by supporting these fatwas and these battles that even go against the morals of humanity, against the morals of the Bible. So does that
Yeah.
make us complicit?
Yeah, well, yeah, and and the thing about it is going back just a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, I know what you mean, but when I hear the word end time, I kind of cringe just a little bit, because there are things that have happened for centuries and centuries. People say, well, if this happens, this is the end. If this
Right.
happens, this is the end. The Bible says a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years.
Correct.
Now, we obviously are in time, but even in Matthew 24, he says, don't be concerned about the time and so forth and so on. But when you see these particular things happen, be aware
Right.
and know that when the army surrounds the city, and by the way, in the book of Revelation, there's a similar thing. When the army surrounds the city, basically there's an interesting thing going to happen. And it's a good thing. But it was also a good thing in Matthew 24, ultimately, because that brought in the kingdom of Christ.
Right. That ushered in and crossed the threshold of the last day.
Yes, yes, yes. So these things are interesting, and I hear things, many things right now, trying to relate the current things to typical in what I would call end time prophecy. And a lot of that is, we're focusing on the wrong thing. And it's not that certain physical events won't happen, but if we don't focus on the heart of a man, that becomes the heart of men that creates systems that are opposed to Christ or instead of Christ. That's the issue. And if we look at all these other things and forget that is the main issue, we're going off on a tangent that it becomes then something that it's not.
You're
Because at the
exactly
end of the day, this is a religious battle and a spiritual battle, and we can't forget that. And even the book of Revelation, there are certain physical things in the book of Revelation, but most of that is talking about what's happening within the heart of a man.
Right.
And this number 666 tells us that man is mankind with his eyes open.
Right.
Just like Eve, though, and not matured into the sense of Christ that they need to.
I agree completely. Can we move on to how the economic structure is being manipulated and molded to fall into the progressive movement, which will lead us that much closer to the coming of the Lord?
Yeah. So several. I was noticing in some of your notes and other things you were going to discuss that, I think most people don't realize. Let's take first just from a pure financial system. Our financial system years ago was corrupted. And what happened is a lot of things that were supposed to be for we the people became privatized.
Right.
Most people don't realize that central banks around the world are private entities, and they work in association with the Bank of International Settlements, which is also a private entity.
Now, wait a minute. For those that aren't following, let me say this. You're talking about major financial families that own the central banks and the Bank of International Settlement, control the International Monetary Fund, and actually pull the strings in high places on how economies run, rise, or fall.
Yes, yeah. I mean, for example, our Federal Reserve here in the United States, when the money that they loan and the money that they receive, that's a private entity.
Can I put this in here real quick? December the 23rd, 1913, on Jekyll Island, the major bankers in America and Europe came together and formed the Federal Reserve, which gave them the right to print and loan currency to governments, or what we call sovereigns, around the world, not only in the United States, but in Europe, giving them total control on the rise and fall of the value of the currency, which is to say the IOU they issued you, saying that it was good for a certain value. That's owned by 13, is it 13 or 9 families?
Well, I'm not exactly sure about how that exactly plays out, but it's definitely private. Let's just say this, though, it's definitely privately owned.
It's privately owned and controlled, correct. So the Federal Reserve is not a government entity.
Correct. Never has been, never will be.
All right. Go ahead and pick it up from there. I'm sorry to interrupt.
So basically you had an entity years ago that basically loaned money to the United States, but also took our receipts. So our federal tax receipts don't go to running, in effect, the United States of America. Those receipts are sent out And because of that, money is loaned to us, and we run on a fiat system. Our system is not, our fiat currency system is not backed by anything tangible at this point. So we owe, 30 to 60 trillion dollars right now to someone that's not an American citizen.
Can I say this, D? America is a debt-created economy, correct?
Correct.
We are a debtor. We do not have assets. We're loaning money, creating debt, and putting that debt as accounts receivable on our ledger to prove that we have worth, but our worth is only as good as our ability to collect, and we're unsustainable. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. Right now, it is an impossibility for the United States to pay back the debt that it technically owes. But that debt is owed to outside individuals. That was never meant to be the case, from day one on our formation as a country. But that's what ended up happening.
Could you say the Federal Reserve was actually set up to control the gold reserve that America had and put it into private hands instead of into the hands of the public?
Well, I think that's probably what happened. The United States had gold, and when we went away from the gold standard, basically that gold was pledged and then taken away for these particular debts then that we would owe to this Federal Reserve, the central bank, which was privatized.
So I guess you would say it was at 1923 or so when Roosevelt confiscated all the gold?
I think that's correct.
And to do that, he made it illegal for Americans to own gold coin or gold bullion that was certified by the U.S. government,
Yes,
and then turned around and sold it in the open market to raise money to cover World War I, excuse me.
Yeah, it's for a period of time. For a period of time, all the gold was confiscated.
Right.
And so then what happens is the citizens of the United States did not have a store of value that they could keep, which they could control. So then they gave away control of their financial system.
I know people ask me all the time, how can they pass a law or tax us or go into debt without our authority, put our great-grandchildren into an unsustainable load, financial load, without even getting approval from the people? And I think we had a revolution that was built on taxation without representation because of that very thing.
Well, the interesting thing is what they've done in taxation is not legal. But I guess the population doesn't know what they don't know for a while. And so and what happened was when the financial system was changed and privatized, what we did in effect was give outside influences control over us.
Right.
And we still, and even today, what people don't realize is that they have money in certain places in the stock market, in the bank. They don't actually have control of those funds.
You're right.
And that would shock people, but they don't actually have control of the funds. If for example, you have your funds at a brokerage and you have your money in stocks, people think that they own that share of stock. They don't own the share of stock.
Now, wait a minute.
The brokerage.
Wait, before you go there. Number one, I want to make sure we're picking up good sound on this for our production guy over here. But also, under the Dodd-Frank Act, that eliminated your ability to own anything when you put it in control of an investment broker. Is that correct?
That is correct. So I mean, in a perfect world, if the brokerage firms act ethically and do what they're supposed to do, you may be fine and you may be able to receive your funds when you sell those stocks one day. But if they don't, you have zero control whatsoever over your own funds that you've put in.
Isn't that the same thing now with you deposit money into a bank? That bank is considered a commercial lending institution. Keep going. I'm sorry. I just want to throw that in.
Yeah, no, it's the same thing in a bank. If that bank goes under, well, you've got the FDIC, which is supposedly supposed to guarantee certain monies, but they're broke. They have no monies.
That's right.
So what's been happening is, and we've seen bank failures, and we'll get into this probably shortly. We'll see a lot more bank failures. But of the bank failures we've seen, basically the FDIC has gone in and asked another bank to purchase them, and in effect, they would make some guarantees to the purchasing bank. Well, the problem is they don't have the money to substantiate the guarantees that they're making. So at some point, this begins to roll and so forth and so on. And if you can't print new money and create new funds, all of a sudden, at some point, the game ends, and all you have sitting there is a huge debt obligation that somebody's got to pay.
Well, I don't want to frighten anyone, but I sent you an article today that shows that J.P. Chase Morgan and Bank of America and Citibank have over $32 trillion in off-ledger accounts that they are on the line for, that they have no receivables to cover. And everyone that has deposited money in J.P. Morgan Chase or Bank of America or Citibank stand at risk right now. If they default or they go insolvent, that money belongs to the entity, not to you anymore. It belongs to the FDIC because they guaranteed it. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Yes, because the monies that they owe off balance sheet, that they're basically, for example, all banks work on leverage,
right?
And historically, it's been a leverage of 8 to 10 to 1. But when you take those off balance sheet assets, that leverage goes up to 40, 50, 60, 70 times the amount of capital that they have in order to cover those challenges that they may eventually have. So what happens is with the off balance sheet stuff, the leverage that we think the banks have is dramatically greater than what they're showing basically on their normal set of books.
All right. So whatever you're looking at, say like the bank in Pennsylvania, was it the Republic Bank in Pennsylvania with 124 different branches that just went under?
Correct.
And the FDIC came in and pulled that together and sold it back to another banking entity. And they guaranteed the entity the finance to do it. We had a program that just ended this month. I think we should talk about. Was it the Banking Temporary Monetary Fund that went into effect after the fall of the Silicon Valley Bank and the Republic Bank, that allowed banks to borrow money to cover their off-ledger loss or uncollectible assets for a year. And so they borrowed all this money. The feds, in turn, printed all this money to loan them, which only put more money into the economy, which increased the inflation rate. And now, according to Europe, we're over 30% inflation, meaning that your dollar is spending in the marketplace, and it's not worth what it was before. So what we're looking at is a Ponzi scheme, isn't it? They're creating notes and bonds to sell to our allies or to international banks and creating those bonds themselves. They're writing paper to sell to create money that they print themselves to put in the system to try to hold up the insolvency of our banking system. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. If you remember, and you go back to 2007, 2008, you remember the mortgage crisis.
Right.
You remember CMB's commercial mortgage-backed securities were developed. And I don't think most people realize what happened there, but it's very similar to what's happening now on all kinds of different financial fronts. What happened is back then, a bank or an institution or a mortgage company would have, let's just say, 1,000 different loans. And 800 of those loans were bad loans. They were basically junk. You had 10% more that were a little better. You had 5% more that were a little better. And then you had 5% of those loans that were actually AAA good,
loan,
solid
right.
Mortgage loans.
Right.
So what the brokerages would do, they would package those loans together, put that 5% good loans on top with basically 80+% of non-performing poor loans on the bottom. They would package that together and sell that as a AAA corporate mortgage bond obligation. So so what happened was, then all of a sudden we begin to have the mortgages begin to default, and those packages are virtually worthless. What they were sold is AAA, solid, good mortgage packages. Well, same thing's happening now in all kinds of different areas on the financial front.
Is that called arbitrage in the banking terms?
Called what?
Arbitrage in the banking terms?
Well, arbitrage is just it's kind of like neutral Switzerland. Arbitrage can be perfectly fine and perfectly good, or arbitrage can be perfectly horrendous. It just depends upon what the arbitrage is doing. Arbitrage, we have things that are, we work with arbitrage every day in a very, very simple sense. If I have an investment over here, I have another investment over here that supposedly they work differently and so forth and so on. And if one goes down, the other picks it up.
Right.
So arbitrage can be good. It can be like an insurance policy. But the problem comes when you've got arbitrage on both sides and both sides fail.
So what you're saying is that arbitrage is derivatives, and derivatives, the way we have been experiencing them, has been fraud.
Well, if you look at the word derivative, the first part of the word is derive.
Right.
They're financial products that are derived from something else.
Right.
So what you're doing is you're taking certain things that, I'll give you a great example. Take a ETF that's a gold, quote, supposedly backed ETF.
Electronic traded funds, right?
Yeah. So you've got a paper entry that you own certain gold. You own no physical gold with that investment. So if the person on the other side cannot perform with the physical delivery of gold when you ultimately ask them to,
on demand, right?
On demand, that ETF is worthless.
That's right.
Now, it may or may not, but so what happens is if there's more gold being traded than's actually there for physical delivery.
Well, let me ask you a question. I know we're jumping around a little bit, and we'll get back on point, but that's why I get a lot of questions about the COMEX when people want to buy gold. The COMEX, by and large, is nothing more than a derivative of paper, not physical gold or silver. And for instance, I heard that if everyone that owned paper in the COMEX demanded delivery, there would be 392 individuals saying they all own the same ounce of gold. Now that's a little out of proportion, isn't it?
Well, it is, and if you go back to some of the stuff we were talking about on stocks, when a person buys stocks at a brokerage, it's probably not to that degree, but you have the same thing happening.
Those of you that are following us and would like to get more information on this, see the QR code over my right shoulder. That'll take you to our website. You can ask questions. We will answer. We will respond. And we would love to have response from you. We're going a little deeper here in the very beginning of the broadcast. We're going to get more back to a application of current events and prophetic events in the part 2, which we will be filming immediately after this. We're limited with the Zoom time that we have. We're going to have to reinstate that. So be prepared. Don't leave us. This will be aired this week. Next week will be part 2. Those of you that go to our website, look at our application there for products. Also, there's a donate button. We definitely need your help. We're going into things you will not hear in your pulpit, but you need to know as a Christian, as an American, and as the provider for your home. May God bless you. May God bless your home, your church, and may God bless America. Thank you for being with us.